Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Unexpected Entrepreneur Podcast. Today we are chatting all about developing unique brand identity as a photographer.
Okay, so when we're thinking about what is brand identity and what actually goes into brand identity, the first thing that you're probably going to think of is the brand visuals. So we're talking about the fonts, logos, color palettes, everything like that. And that is definitely part of the brand identity, but that's not going to be the whole story. So the brand identity also has to do with your ideal client, your brand messaging, so your unique angle, who you serve, everything like that, and your brand voice. So today, we're going to take a look at kind of these four main pieces of the brand identity and what you can kind of do to figure out what that means for your business, how it relates to your brand, and how you can use it to actually build out your brand. All right, so we're going to kick it off with ideal clients because this is kind of the main thing that everything else in your brand is going to be based on. So this is definitely the first step that you want to do before you start anything else. And we do have an entire podcast episode specifically about ideal clients. That is how important defining your ideal client is. But just to kind of give a brief overview of what we talked about in that episode, if you haven't heard it, your ideal client is going to be your dream client. So this is the person who you're going to work with 10 times out of 10. When they come through in your inbox or in your CRM, you're like, yes, finally, this is who I want to work with. So when you're thinking about that, you can ask yourself questions like, what's their age range? Where do they shop? What types of clothes do they wear? Are there any certain jobs or industries that you tend to attract more? Do they all share a hobby? Are they all looking for something similar with your services? Anything like that. These are all going to help you curate the rest of your brand. So everything you do, your brand messaging, your brand voice, your brand visuals are all going to be based towards this ideal client. So the first step before you do anything else is to figure out your ideal client. And keep in mind that this is something that can change, and it most likely will change over the course of you running your business. So who your ideal client is right now might not be your ideal client in 5 years. It might not be your ideal client in 10 years. Inkpot's had a few different changes in our ideal clients. When, early days, our ideal clients, we probably would have just said creatives and entrepreneurs. And we kind of just hit that general world of entrepreneurship. Now we know that we're much more specific and we target wedding photographers or wedding pros in general. So it is something that will probably change over the years, and that's totally fine. But each time you're going through this kind of branding process, you want to first take time to figure out who your ideal client is.
Would you say skipping this step is one of the most detrimental
Oh, yeah,
parts?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it's so hard to do anything else and create anything else that's actually strategic and works for you if you don't know who you're talking to. So it's the same thing if you're like trying to teach someone math, but you don't know if they're a second grader or if they're a 12th grader or if they're 36. That's going to really dictate how you teach the subject, how do you talk to them, what you say. So if you don't know who your ideal client is, you're going to really struggle with your brand messaging, with your brand voice, and actually connecting and finding those people.
I think when it comes to this step in particular, so many people get it confused because they think that when it comes to their brand visuals, which again, we'll talk about a little bit later, but they think that everything has to be about them. And instead of like thinking about who am I trying to speak to, they're like, oh, well, I don't like the color orange, so orange can't be in my brand. But what if that's what your clients would want to see from you? What if they want to see that radiance and that vibrance in your brand? What if they're drawn to the color orange because, they really love some other brand that also uses orange? So like 100% do not skip this step. It is going to be one of the most influential pieces of developing your unique brand identity. And it's going to be so weird sitting down and trying to think about, who do I want to work with? Who do I like to work with? It's one of those questions that like, even when we're asked, sometimes we like just have like the massivest brain fart and we're like, but then we like sit and think about it and we're like, okay, never mind. Like this is who we like to work with. It's one of those things that the more times you get asked, the better you'll get at also figuring out like who it is that you like to work with.
And it's also when KB was talking about what your ideal clients are going to want to see. And if they're going to want to see orange, like maybe it might be good to have orange in your color palette. It's almost the same as when it comes to blogging, right? What you want to maybe write in blogging and what people are actually searching for may be two completely different things. So anything in business and anything in marketing, you really have to take time and do your research and think about who you're actually trying to target and put yourself in their shoes. What are they going to want to see? And that's what you can create in your own business.
Next is brand messaging. So this is not to be confused with brand voice, which Desi is going to dive into right after this, but brand messaging is what you're saying and your brand voice is how you're saying it. So when it comes to brand messaging, you really need to try to think about what your mission is in your business and how you're going to try to get that point across in words. So when you're thinking of your brand messaging, the most obvious one that you're going to try to think of is your tagline. So this is usually something that you're going to repeat a lot in your business. It can also be called like your angle. It's things that, is really going to easily resonate with your audience. And it's probably things that are really going to kind of stop them in their tracks and they are going to start to repeat it back to you, especially on discovery calls. So for example, here at Inkpot, one of ours is websites that work when wedding season hits. We say this one all the time in our marketing. If you've been following us for a few months now, you'll see it's a very popular tagline for us now. We also say high key websites for low key people, showcase your work through a new lens, weird websites work, designed differently. These are all different forms of taglines and messaging that we use. And then, of course, we also have our mission statement, which you really want to be very short and to the point with. Usually, one sentence is all that you need. Copywriters are so helpful when it comes to this. If you can hire someone for brand messaging, tone of voice help, trust me, you'll get it all figured out so quickly. We actually worked with Corey Whitby to get ours figured out, and it was so, so helpful. Like, for instance, our mission statement is Inkpot Creative helps out of the box photographers show off their work and book dream clients on autopilot with a website that celebrates what makes them different. So it's saying exactly who we are, who we help, and how we help them. So let's say you are a Colorado photographer. We're always going back to Colorado because that's where we lived last. And let's also say that you really like to work with very unconventional couples and you love to photograph elopements. So, you could be like, KP Photography is a Colorado based elopement photographer business serving unconventional couples who want a wedding day that breaks all of the rules, quote unquote. Something like that would be your mission statement. And then you would want to try to come up with some really fun taglines that kind of help to push that mission statement forward.
Can your brand messaging also touch on like the types of couples or types of like the style of photography that you actually shoot in? So let's say like if you're really good at taking candids or you're really good at like the dramatic, edited, looks like it should be in a magazine type of photo, like can your brand messaging touch on that too?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to your brand messaging, I think the more to the point and specific and niche you can be, the better. Because even if you feel like you're really talking to like one person and one person only, that's actually a good thing. So again, when we were talking about ideal clients last week, we talked all about how you really need to have like that ideal client avatar. So let's say, Sally, you're always talking to Sally in your messaging. You want to pretend that even like in your mission statement, in your tagline, that it's really going to speak to that specific type of person. And the more specific you can be, the more they're going to feel called out and the more they're going to be like, oh, this business gets me, this photographer gets me, this brand gets me. And it's going to make them want to reach out to you even more.
Now, KP mentioned when she talked about brand messaging, the brand messaging is what you say and your brand voice is how you say it. So when we're thinking about your brand voice, one of the things that can help kind of decide or dictate what your brand voice is your brand archetype. So there's 12 brand archetypes and there's a ton of different tools out there that you can use to kind of figure out what your brand archetype is and what it might be. But for us, if we use Inkpot as an example, we are the creator archetype. So when we're looking at the creator, that's going to be people that are innovative, disruptive, expressive, individual, kind of outside of the norm.
A good example of the creator archetype is also Apple. If you just think of Apple, so we're almost like embodying kind of like what Apple is in a way.
And that's a really good way to like, you can look up brand archetypes and figure out what yours is and then Google, brand archetype with like popular brands, and people will give you examples of bigger companies that are those brands to kind of give you a better idea of how that's embodied and what it actually looks like in a noticeable, recognizable brand that you're like, okay, I know what North Face looks like, and I know what their brand messaging is, and I know what their social media looks like and what their website looks like. So now I understand what that archetype is. And once you have that, your brand archetype can help you figure out your tone of voice. So for us as creatives, since we are those people who are kind of innovative and disruptive and everything like that, our tone of voice is going to come off, one, knowledgeable, because we do know what we're talking about, and that's a big part of it. But on the other hand, it's also going to come off, playful, really unconventional and bold. So we're not going to be super serious. We're never going to, feel like the luxury clothing brands or, a super high up financial institute. Like that's not what Inkpot is ever going to embody. And that's not what we're going to feel like because that's not what our brand archetype is. So a lot of our messaging and a lot of our tone of voice is really fun. I think we throw in references to different TV shows and we have
RuPaul.
fun. We have RuPaul, we have Sashay Away on our website. Like those fun touches are going to connect with our ideal audience because that is the type of people that want to work with us. And that's the type of people that we love working with. And so when you're thinking about your brand voice, you can think about general things like, do you want to be super serious or do you want to be really casual? Do you want to throw in jokes or do you want to keep it kind of more strict? When you're thinking about your brand voice, you really want to think about what you're saying and how you want to say it to make sure that it comes off in the way that you want it to. So again, if you can, there's tons of quizzes out there and different ways to figure out what your brand archetype is if you haven't done that already and if you don't already know. And then take some time, do a little research, figure out what companies you recognize are that brand archetype that you are, just so it kind of gives you a better idea of how you can exemplify that in your business. And then that'll help you kind of figure out your tone of voice moving forward.
Kind of going off that too, like Jesse was saying, there are so many quizzes out there. Literally just go on Google and search brand archetype quiz. You will find so many that can really help you try to decipher which one you are in your brand. And also, when you find out what one you are, don't be afraid of like pulling up, 5 of that same exact archetype. So for instance, one of the archetypes is the explorer archetype. I bring this one up too because our travel blog is very much the explorer archetype. But, REI, Columbia, North Face, Jeep, these are all explorer archetypes and they all use that messaging completely different. So it'll just kind of show you how, even though they are all the same exact archetype, they are all still really talking to their ideal client, which are all slightly different, but have a lot of overlap. I would also say, too, Jesse, you can let me know if you agree with me on this or not, but I feel like brand voice is one of the ones where, as a photographer, you do still really want to keep your ideal client in mind, but you also want it to feel like you.
Yeah, that's a big thing when you are kind of the face behind your brand. And realistically, for most photographers, you are going to have a personal brand, meaning you are probably the only person in your business. You might have some, second shooters or associate photographers that work with you, but you are the face of your business. Your business name is probably your name with photography on the end of it. So at the end of the day, what you're saying and how you're saying it, like you want to make sure that it connects with you and it feels good to you. Because the last thing you want to do is have a website that's super serious and like everything feels very tight knit and buttoned up. And then someone gets on a discovery call with you and you're cracking jokes and talking about Parks and Rec. And they're like, this seems a little off. Like, I don't know if I like it or not. So when you're thinking about your brand voice, if you are in this case where realistically you do have a personal brand, you want to make sure that your voice and your brand voice match up so that when you're talking with clients, when you're at weddings, when you're at sessions, you don't feel like you have to put on a facade or be a different person because at the end of the day, that's never going to work. That's not going to be sustainable and that's not going to be fun. So definitely make sure that you are able to connect them and you feel good about how you're saying things and it kind of matches up with how you would say stuff in your normal life.
Yeah, even here at Inkpot, I'd say like our tone of voice is very much how we speak with like a little bit of pizzazz.
I would say that with maybe a little cleaner, just because we try to keep it a little cleaner in the business area. But yeah, it's definitely like when you talk to us, we're maybe a little more outgoing online than we are in real life because we're a bit introverted. But
But I also
it,
feel like our brand makes us feel a little bit more extroverted sometimes. Like, because we
yeah,
show up as our brand,
yeah,
which
it
is
really
also kind of
does.
another cool part of honing in on your brand.
Mhm.
It gives you that confidence. Okay, last but not least, we did want to talk about brand visuals. So, this is going to be all of the fun stuff. When you're like, oh, I can't wait to work with a brand designer, like, I really want to have a nice brand, this is what you're thinking of. You're not thinking about deciding who your ideal clients are, working on brand messaging, brand voice, everything like that. So, your brand visuals are, your primary logo, secondary logo, alternate logo if you have one, your brand marks, your icons, and everything like that, down to like the colors and the fonts. So, this is the stuff that once you have all of that other information figured out, please do not skip all that other stuff. Your brand visuals should come last. And that's because by the time you get to really designing out your brand, you know exactly who you're targeting, you know what the messaging is going to be, you know the tone, which can really help you kind of develop a specific vibe and aesthetic when it comes to your brand visuals. And this is another one where you really want to hone in on what your ideal clients would want to see. So you want to kind of look at what other brands are they buying from. That's why on our strategy calls, actually, we always ask like, who is your ideal client? Where do they like to shop? It's because we want to know like what other places are they attracted to? kind of going off of that too, when it comes to your brand visuals, this is another one of the ones that even though you do really want to make sure it's what's going to appeal to your ideal clients, I think it is one too that you still want to make sure you actually like your brand.
No, I totally agree. And I think it's one of the things where, again, like your brand voice, it needs to connect with you as a person. And if you have a brand, like if we had a brand that was rainbow, because that's what our brand is, and we were like, okay, I hate color. I hate wearing color. I hate being around color. I don't want to see anything colorful. It would be really disconnected from us. But we do like color. Granted, we do wear a lot of not colored things. We also wear a lot of colored things. So it kind of evens out and matches up. But if you're at the point where you're like, okay, I could not hate anything more than the color pink. Like it grosses me out. I hate seeing it. I never want to be associated with it, but your ideal clients might want to see that, or it's in other brands that they like. That doesn't mean that you have to put it in there. Like you can still make sure that you enjoy your brand, but your brand shouldn't just be your favorite colors because you might not be your ideal client, which is a huge thing that you kind of have to connect with and understand. So it does play a role in it. You do want to make sure that you like the brand and you're proud to show it off, and you're not like, I'm not really going to use this because I don't like it. But you should also make sure that your ideal clients are going to like it because that's who's actually going to pay you based on that brand.
When it comes to your colors too, one of the really cool things you get to start to play around with when it comes to brand visuals is color psychology. So every color is going to kind of play with each like with other colors differently. I took a whole color psychology class in college, so like this stuff really excites me. But for instance, like when you think of red, you think of like, passion and love and sometimes anger and strength. When you think of yellow, you're thinking of happiness and, just feeling good. And then meanwhile, you think of green and you could be thinking of like nature or money. So every color is going to have some type of feeling attached to it. So you do also want to kind of pay attention to the different feelings that the colors that you're choosing have on your audience.
All right. So when it comes to fonts, how do fonts actually play in? Because I know that this seems to be the one that people ignore the most. And they're just like, oh, well, I just used the like default fonts wherever I'm going. Like whatever's just there, that's what I use on my website or what I use on my social media. Why is it important that you actually find fonts that match up with your ideal client? What can that like look like? Anything like that?
Okay, so love this question too. I think Jesse also took this entire typography class back in college, so we know a lot about fonts. But essentially, you really want to pay attention to the fonts that you're picking and not just like, use the random ones that were in the template that you purchased off Etsy, because each font is also going to have a specific feeling associated with it. So when you think of luxury brands, you're probably thinking of really skinny, thin, lightweight serif fonts. So those are just the fonts that have the sort of like little lines at the end of everything. I think it's so hard to explain via podcast, but you kind of get what I'm saying. So like if you think of Louis Vuitton, it's got all the little lines at the end. And then there's also sans serif fonts, which those feel a lot more lightweight and playful. So like when you think of Apple.
Yeah, I think when we're looking at it too, like there's those feelings of what is associated with it kind of in the rest of the media. So when we think of like those thicker, sans serif fonts like Apple or Nike, Under Armour. Like if you look at Nike, Under Armour, Adidas, Puma, they all have almost the same font. And it's that thick font, no serifs. It's just there. It's very clean and minimal, but you look at it and you're like, oh, that feels like Nike, or oh, that feels like Under Armour. So you have those feelings associated with it, but it can also be like outside feelings that you want to make sure match with your brand vibe. So we've had people who maybe are a little more on like the edgier side with their photography style. So maybe their photography style, they might do film, or it might feel kind of more, 70s, 80s rocker. If they were to then go and have a font that felt like Louis Vuitton, it would totally not connect with their ideal client. They need a font that feels like, the rock band's fonts for their, band name or anything like that. That's going to connect way more, and it's going to look better with all of their content, because if your logos, if your fonts match the style of everything else, your whole brand is going to come together and it's going to connect way more.
One last thing I did want to mention about brand visuals too is that you need more than a primary logo. I could go on a whole rant about this
Oh
because
yeah.
In the past, have worked with a lot of clients over the years, and for a while, we didn't offer branding anymore. So we actually just started offering branding again last fall, early winter, and we had actually just not offered it for like a year and a half. And the main reason we started offering it again was because we've had a lot of inquiries where people will say that they have a brand, but they only have like a primary logo. And the reason why we say that you need so much more is because if you have just a primary logo and you go to design your website, you are going to be missing out on so much because you're not going to have like all those really fun like little brand accents or illustrations or patterns that can really bring like the entire brand to life. Like you really want to create an entire experience on your website because your website is like one of the first touch points in the customer journey before someone officially reaches out. So you really just want to streamline everything as much as you can and do whatever you can to stand out from the other people in your industry or in your area. So some of the logos that we always recommend you have is your primary logo. That's usually what's going to be in like your website header. You're also going to want an alternate logo or a secondary logo. So essentially this is going to be your primary logo, but with all the kind of like pieces taken out of it. If you have like a fun monogram attached to like your primary logo, usually you'd kind of like strip it down. It'd be very simple and it would be like a completely horizontal version so that if you ever do need like a horizontal completely straight logo anywhere, you'll have one because believe it or not, you might need one at some point. And then there's also brand marks. So usually these can be like little monograms. Those work really well for like your little website favicon, which is what shows up in like your browser tab right next to your website name. If you don't update that on your website, pause this podcast and go update that. This is an issue we see all the time. And then also other versions of brand marks could be like round emblems or things like that. So just other variations basically of your primary logo. Then there's also brand icons. These can be fun like illustrations and things that can be used throughout the website.
And also, when we're looking at primary logos, I know Katie mentioned like your secondary logo might be horizontal. It could also be the opposite way.
It could
So
be the
if you
opposite, yeah.
have a horizontal primary logo, have a stacked alternate logo because that'll just give you a lot of flexibility. And sometimes a stacked logo is just too thick for where you're trying to put it. And sometimes a horizontal logo is just too long for where you're trying to put it. So giving yourself both options gives you way more flexibility, and then you don't also have to use the same logo in every single place because sometimes you just might not want to use it. You're like, oh my god, I've used this logo 4,000 times, and it would be nice to have one that was just slightly different and brought like a different type of visual interest to whatever I'm creating.
It's one of those things too, like every single logo has a spot that it's going to fit best, kind of like Jesse was saying. So like you might use your primary logo in your website navigation, but then maybe in your footer you want to use a brand mark so that it's showing like your brand logo sort of in like a circle instead. And then maybe you print out business cards and your primary logo doesn't fit best on the business card, but it's okay because you have like the secondary logo that fills the space better. So overall, you just want to make sure you have all the options because I'm sure even now if you're like listening to this podcast and you have one logo, you're probably thinking, wow, yeah, I went to go print something last week or, a few months ago and I totally realized that my logo looks really funny in this position because I don't have other options. So that was all that we had for this week. Again, if you are interested in getting your branding done and working with a studio, we are booking brand only projects as well as brand and website projects, and we would love to chat with you about what that could look like. Our application form is always in the show notes, but we will be back next week with a special guest, so be sure to tune in next Wednesday.